While we already went over factoring as a great way to find the solutions to our quadratic or x squared equations, we actually have another tool in our toolbox called the quadratic formula. To use the quadratic formula, we need to remember that the standard form of a quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And when we are asked to solve quadratic equations, we can plug these numbers in, these coefficients, so a being the coefficient in front of x squared, b being the coefficient in front of x, and c being a constant at the very end. We can plug these numbers into our quadratic formula. For example, we have a is our coefficient in front of x squared, and it goes here and here. We have b, which is our coefficient in front of our x, and that goes here, here, and then we have c, which is our constant, and our constant goes here. So without further ado, let's get down to doing some example problems with this new formula. All right, let's get down to it. So we have an equation, and it says solve using the quadratic formula. And just for this first problem, I went ahead and kept our quadratic formula over here so we could look at it for reference. And what I like to do when solving for my quadratic formula is I like to start by identifying my a, my b, and my c. So a is going to be that number in front of your x squared. B is going to be that number in front of your x. And c is going to be that final constant. So when there's no number in front of your x squared, that means that we have an invisible 1, right? When there's no number in front of a variable, there's an invisible 1 there. So a is 1, b is 6, and c is 5. It's time to plug it into our formula. So our formula says x equals negative b. We know b is 6, so negative 6 plus or minus the square root of b squared. So we have 6 squared minus 4ac, minus 4 times a, which we said was 1, times c, which we said was 5, and it's all under the square root. I've seen students before forget to put the entire thing there under the square root, but everything b squared minus 4ac, all of that is under the square root. And then finally on the bottom, we divide by 2a. We said, of course, a is just 1. So let's go ahead and simplify this a little bit. So the negative 6 we'll leave alone for now, negative 6 plus or minus. 2 times 1 on the bottom, well, we know that to be 2. 6 squared, we know to be 36. And 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 5 is 20. I just simplified some of my terms. I simplified the squaring and the multiplication real quick. And what happens after that is we still have negative 6 on top, plus or minus the square root. What's 36 minus 20? And you can do this in your calculator if you don't know, but what you'll get is you'll get 16. We know that the square root of 16 is 4. So now we got to break this up into two new problems. We have negative 6 plus 4 over 2. And we have negative 6 minus 4 over 2. Negative 6 plus 4 is negative 2. Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. So for this solution here, we get negative 1. Negative 6 minus 4 is negative 10. Negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5. So for this solution, we get negative 5. So coming from putting it all back together again, x equals both of the things we got. Remember, quadratics often have two answers. We get negative 1 and negative 5. They don't always have two answers, but they do pretty often. And if you want to check it, you can plug it back into the original equation and make sure that you get 0. Right, so just like all the finer things in life, if you want to get it down, you need to practice. So let's start by rewriting our quadratic formula so we remember what it is. Our quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now what we need to do is we need to identify our a, our b, and our c. So there's nothing in front of that x squared, which means that there is an invisible 1. So our a is going to be that invisible 1. Then our b is going to be the number in front of our x, which is 4. Now our c is a little bit different this time because we have minus 21. We need to make sure that when we write our c down, our c includes negative. So it's a negative 21. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put it into our equation, into our quadratic formula. So negative b, that's negative 4, plus or minus the square root of b, which is 4, squared, minus 4 times a, which we said was 1, times c, which is negative 21, all over 2 times a. Let's go ahead and start simplifying. So there's really nothing we can do with that negative 4 in front of the plus or minus. But when we look inside the square root, 4 squared, 4 times 4 is 16. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 times negative 21, I'm going to do in my calculator. So negative 4 times negative 21, I get positive 84. And I get a positive because we're multiplying a negative times a negative. So I get a positive 84. And then it's all over 2 times 1. Well, 2 times 1 is just 2. So let's simplify it further, and let's go ahead and solve what's inside this root here. Let's go ahead and do this part next. So we're going to keep the negative 4. Oops. I'm going to try to stay consistent here. We're going to keep that negative 4 plus or minus square root 16 plus 84. That's going to be 100. Let me double check that just to be safe. Yay. All right, so it will be 100. And we're dividing that by 2. So now, square root of 100. You can use your calculator for this if you want to. But if you know from prior knowledge that the square root of 100 is 10, that's good too. So the square root of 100 is 10. And now what we have to do is we have to break it up into two problems. We have negative 4 plus 10 over 2. And we have negative 4 minus 10 over 2 because it's plus or minus. That plus or minus here, that's the reason that we break it up. Because there's one scenario where this is plus and there's one scenario where this is minus. So in the plus case, negative 4 plus 10 is going to be positive 6. Positive 6 divided by 2 is going to be 3. So this top one here is going to give you a 3. Then down here, negative 4 minus 10 is negative 14. Negative 14 divided by 2 is negative 7. So this bottom one down here will give you a negative 7. So when we put it all back together, we get that x equals negative 7 and x equals 3. And these are the solutions of this equation. All right, so we are again being asked to solve with the quadratic formula. So let's go ahead and recall our formula as negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And you probably know the drill. Next, what we need to do is we need to identify our a, b, and our c. This time we have a number in front of our x squared, so our a is not 1, but our a is instead 8. Our b is going to be this negative 34, so be very careful when writing it. We need to include that negative. And our c is going to be this positive 30. So let's go ahead and let's put it into the formula. So we have x equals negative b. Well, b is already negative, so it's going to be a negative 34. Plus or minus the square root. By the way, just in case you're wondering, one of those negatives is coming from the formula, and the other negative is coming from the fact that the 34 is negative in our equation. So we have two different negatives we have to deal with. Then anyway, we have b squared. B squared is going to be negative 34 squared. That does not look very good. Let me fix that real quick. Negative 34 squared. Then we have minus 4ac, minus 4 times a, which is 8, times c, which is 30. And it's all over 2a. All right, let's get to simplifying. Well, the first thing I can do is a negative 34. A negative 1 times a negative 34. That's just going to give me a positive 34. So we're going to change this. The negative is going to cancel out, and it's going to become positive 34. Next, we need to find negative 34 squared. And if you're using a calculator to do this, make sure you type parentheses and include the negative inside the parentheses and the square outside, exactly how I wrote it over here. And the reason for that is if you keep the negative outside the parentheses, the calculator is going to think you're doing negative 1 times 34 squared. But when we square a negative number, we have to get a positive. And the calculator is going to tell you it's a negative if you're not careful. So if you do include the negative, just be sure, put it inside the parentheses, and then square it. And we get a positive 1156. Next, what we're going to do is negative 4 times 8. Well, that's negative 32. Negative 32 times 30. Negative 32 times 30 gives me negative 960. So we're going to go minus 960. And then finally, it's over 2 times 8. Well, 2 times 8 is just 16. All right, so we've simplified it quite a bit. Let's go ahead and take care of the inside of that square root. So 1156 minus 960. We get 196 is left on the inside there. So we get 34 plus or minus the square root of 196. And I just used my calculator to get that. I did 1156 minus 960. And it's still all over 16. All right, let's keep going. I'm going to do the square root of 196 in my calculator. And I get 14. So we have 34 plus or minus 14 over 16. And this is the part where we split it up into two problems. So this time, instead of drawing the arrows, I know you know where it's coming from by now, I'm just going to go ahead and write my two problems below. So we have 34 plus 14 over 16 and 34 minus 14 over 16. So 34 plus 14, that's going to give me 48. So we have 48 over 16. 48 over 16, that's going to give me 3. While over here we have 34 minus 14. Well, 34 minus 14 is just going to be 20. 20 over 16, well, we can simplify that, and we can do that by taking a greatest common factor out of both. So factors of 20 include 1 and 20, and 4 and 5, and 2 and 10. Factors of 16 include 2 and 8, 4 and 4, and 1 and 16. And what we think about there, what we realize is that the greatest common factor, the biggest number that I just included in both of their lists, is 4. So if we divide 20 by 4, we get 5. And I wrote a 4 down because I was saying 4, but we get 5 after we divide it. And if we divide a 16 by 4, we get 4. So that means that our solutions here are x equals 3 and 5 over 4. And when you're using the quadratic formula, it is perfectly all right to have a solution that is a fraction. That's actually one reason that the quadratic formula is awesome in a way that the factoring is not, because it is so much easier to understand your solution as a fraction if you're using the quadratic formula. Technically, you're not supposed to get fractions when factoring. So quadratic formula for the win there. All right, one more example. Let's go ahead and let's remember our quadratic formula. Negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Next, we're going to label our parts. So in front of the x squared, we have our a, which is 3. In front of the x, we have our b, which is 5. And at the end there, we have our c, which is negative 10. What we need to do next is we need to go ahead and plug it in. So we have negative b, we said b was 5, so negative 5 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 5 squared, minus 4 ac, so a is 3, c is negative 10, all over 2a. a very ugly line. Give me a minute here. Fix that. Line and a better 2a. There we go. And of course we know a to be 3. Let's go ahead and let's get this thing simplified. And of course this is what x is. So negative 5 is just going to stay by itself. There's nothing we can do with it right now. But we know that 5 squared is 25. And we know that 4 times 3 is 12. And 12 times 10 is 120. And notice that there's two negatives. There's a negative for our c, and there's a negative from the formula. So negative 12 times negative 10 gives me a positive 120. It's all over 6. What to do next is we get that our equation is now negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 145 over 6. So let's go ahead and plug the square root of 145 into our calculator. So I plug the square root of 145 in my calculator, and it tells me that the square root of 145 is just the square root of 145. If you have an older calculator, it will tell you it's a massive decimal. One thing you can do to see if there's anything you can take out is you can try to factor 145 and see, is there a perfect square in there? So I know that 145 is divisible by 5, so let me see what happens when I do that. 145 divided by 5 is 29. Let's see, is 29 divisible by anything? So we got 29 divided by 2 won't work, 29 divided by 3 doesn't work, 29 divided by 4 doesn't work, 29 divided by 5 doesn't, 6 doesn't, 7 doesn't. So 29 is a prime number. There's nothing we can do with the root 145. So many teachers and professors will actually accept this as a final answer, since there's nothing we can do to simplify it further. Some teachers and professors may recommend that you write it out like this, where you have one fraction for the 145 here, or excuse me, for the plus here, and then 1 for the minus here. So you could split that plus or minus up if you wanted to, but there's really nothing else you can do to this, because that square root 145, it's not going anywhere. There's nothing you could do to simplify it. So either one of these boxes would be acceptable to me. All right, so thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you found this video to be helpful, and leave any concerns you have in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching.